All right, so welcome. Welcome everybody to our event on Orwell and British Studies. I am Amanda Perry. I'm the Executive Director for the NACBS, and today we are joined by Eileen Hunt, Laura Beers, and Peter Stansky, who will all be speaking about their recent works before we open it up for a Q&A. I will begin by just briefly introducing all of our speakers today, and then I will turn it over to Eileen to get things started. One other note is if you have a question that comes to mind while everyone is speaking, please do drop it in the chat. And then that way, when we start the Q&A, we can draw both from the chat questions and if anyone's got a question at the time. So feel free to put your questions in at any point. So Eileen will be speaking first. Eileen Hunt is a professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. She is the author or editor of 10 books, most recently, The First Last Man, Mary Shelley and the Post-Apocalyptic Imagination, which traces the sources and legacies of Mary Shelley's 1826 pandemic novel, The Last Man, from ancient plague literature, especially Sophocles, to modern dystopian literature, including Orwell. Her current book projects include a biography of Mary Wollstonecraft, 3 editions of the works of Mary Shelley and Mary Wollstonecraft, and The Women Who Made Orwell, a feminist intellectual history that recovers the story of how a series of unsung literary women shaped the Anglo-Indian boy Eric Blair into one of the greatest political writers in the English language. Next up, we will have Laura Beers, who is a historian of modern Britain, and author of the award-winning Red Ellen, The Life of Ellen Wilkinson, socialist, feminist, internationalist. Also, Your Britain, Media and the Making of the Labour Party, as well as Orwell's Ghosts, Wisdom and Warnings for the 21st Century. A professor at American University, Laura comments frequently on British politics for CNN and BBC. And finally, Peter Stansky, a graduate of Yale, King's College, Cambridge, and Harvard, and now a retired professor of history at Stanford, who has over the years looked at such figures as William Morris, members of the Bloomsbury Group, and George Orwell with particular interest in what they might tell one about Britain. With William Abrams as co-author, he published in 1972, The Unknown Orwell. In 1979, Orwell, The Transformation, still in print. And then last year, The Socialist Patriot, George Orwell, and War. So, Eileen, if you'd like to get us started.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. Great, okay. So when I was asked to do this, I was very honored because both Peter and Laura have just been incredible supporters of my scholarship on Orwell, which has proven to be a little controversial because I'm exploring a theme in Orwell's life and writing that has caused a lot of debate in recent years, which is his history of sexual assault. So I wanted to begin with just genuine, heartfelt thanks to both of my colleagues for supporting my scholarship on a sensitive topic. So I am in the process of writing a book titled The Women Who Made Orwell. And yet I've been on a somewhat convoluted journey as a writer as I've worked on this project. So since we were asked to talk about how we came to work on Orwell, I wanted to tell you the story of how I came to work on this book. So during the pandemic, like most people, I felt eerily as though I was immersed in a kind of dystopian novel, as it were. Life revolved around screens, life revolved around Zoom, and Orwell's haunting image of the telescreen from 1994 obviously came to many of our minds as somehow coming to life in the present day of the coronavirus pandemic. And so that was probably the most immediate reason why I turned to Orwell in 2020 to 2021. But before then, before the pandemic, as part of my research into Mary Shelley's legacies for science fiction, for dystopian literature in particular, I had begun to trace out Orwell's debt to Mary Shelley, and I had taken note of the fact that Orwell originally titled 1984, The Last Man in Europe, and I eventually was able to establish in my most recent book, The First Last Man, that Orwell indeed was aware of Mary Shelley's The Last Man, and most likely took inspiration in part from Mary Shelley's The Last Man in his conceptualization of the original title for 1984. So I had a long history with Orwell, like a lot of folks interested in dystopian literature. I read 1984 in high school and reread it during the pandemic. When I reread it during the pandemic, I was struck by the representation of Julia in particular. And I just became interested in how it is that Orwell came to make this highly liberated, passionate woman the core of his final work, final major work of fiction. I was also interested and disturbed by the sexual violence of the novel. And I think I may have been too young to really understand those parts of the novel when I read it in high school. And when I came back to it during the pandemic, the sexual violence of the novel really stood out and made me wonder where that came from and why it was there. So in my book project, I'm thinking of Julia in some sense as a composite figure. A woman based on real women in his life, going back to his mother and extending through his second wife, Sonia Brownell, and that these women in turn shaped his conception of the woman that he puts at the core of 1984. But it really was the shock of sex and sexual violence in 1984 that gripped my attention. And so I began to read more about Orwell's life. I became also interested in situating Orwell in his intellectual context. Because of my work on tracing Mary Shelley's legacies for both dystopian literature and existentialism and existential literature in the 19th and 20th centuries, I had been teaching a fair amount of Simone de Beauvoir, and I became interested in the coincidence of the fact that in 1949 saw the publication of both 1984 and Beauvoir's The Second Sex. And so I started to become interested in the question of comparing them. At that time, I didn't know, for example, that Orwell's degrees of separation from Beauvoir were not much. That he had a lot of social connections to the French existentialists, and that his friend Mame Paget Kusla and friend Arthur Kusla partied with Beauvoir in Paris in the 1940s at the exact time Orwell was very close with the Kuslas and was working on a human rights manifesto with them. And so I didn't know it at the time, but there are lots of reasons why one might want to compare Orwell and Beauvoir, although they seem like very unlikely points of comparison, intellectually speaking. But what I think I'd like to do in my book is think about Orwell's 1984 as testing the converse of Beauvoir's thesis in The Second Sex. Beauvoir famously argued that woman is basically a product of her engagement with this wider patriarchal culture, and I'd actually like to test whether we can read 1984 as a reversal of that thesis, that effectively man is a product of his engagement with woman, with woman's cultural impact on him over time, and that Winston Smith, as well as the author behind him, Orwell, are both in some senses products of the women who shaped them, especially in a literary sense, from the time he was a young boy. But this line of thinking led me back to Orwell's first girlfriend, Jacintha Buddicom. I had been doing some research about the transmission of Mary Shelley's writings through Victorian Gothic literature and into the early 20th century, especially the science fiction of H.G. Wells. And this led me to study Bram Stoker's reception of Mary Shelley. And in turn, I stumbled across a very interesting fact that George Orwell was not only a huge fan of H.G. Wells when he was a young boy, he also was a huge fan of Bram Stoker. And that during Christmas of 1919, he gave a copy of Bram Stoker's Dracula to his girlfriend, Jacintha Buddicom. And I kept researching this fascinating confluence of intellectual connections and eventually found the owner of a collection of poetry manuscripts written by Jacintha Buddicom, Dione Venables, who sadly passed just last fall. She's the founder of the Orwell Society. Through purely email correspondence with Dione during the pandemic, she sent me scans of manuscripts by Jacintha about the young Eric Blair, the young Orwell, and I wrote an essay for the TLS in early 2021. Exploring the intellectual and romantic and sexually violent relationship between Eric Blair and his first girlfriend, Jacintha, and explored a poem that she wrote about their relationship called Dracula's Daughter, which she claimed she wrote in early 1920, soon after Orwell gave her a copy of Dracula. And the poem, which I published in the TLS alongside the essay, is quite interesting. I think it reflects a lot of, disturbing elements of the romantic relationship between Jacintha and Eric, that it may have been quite a fraught, violent relationship, perhaps in the beginning, and that there was a real dissonance between them in what they wanted out of their relationship, and that Jacintha may have always been fending off Eric's advances, which at that time were taboo. I think that the final sexual assault that drove them apart and drove their families apart must have been really quite severe for it to have had this traumatic effect on their relationship, to the point that they did not correspond again between the time of Orwell leaving for Burma in 1922 until 1949, when Jacintha happened to discover that Orwell was Eric Blair, her first boyfriend, and she initiated a correspondence with him, which we still have in the Orwell archive. Lucky for me, last summer, before Dione passed away, I was able to go to her family archive, her private family archive, and I was able to look at papers that only a handful of scholars have looked at. And I was able to see first-person handwritten evidence of Jacintha Buddicom saying she had been sexually assaulted by George Orwell in 1921. And I think this is important to say, because there is a huge controversy going on in Orwell studies right now about whether we even talk about this fact. And I have seen the first person handwritten evidence that Jacintha Buddicom believed she had been sexually assaulted by George Orwell when she was 20 years old. So I'm just going to leave it there. Looking forward to the discussion. Thanks so much to Peter and to Laura for supporting my work.
All right, thank you so much, Eileen. And then Laura, we will turn it over to you.
There we go. Can you hear me now? Great. I'm going to set a timer for myself because I could talk about Orwell forever, but I'll stop myself at 10 minutes. And again, as Eileen said, our remit in these opening comments was to talk about how we came to our projects on Orwell. And as Amanda said, I've got, this is the galley copies, but in June, my new book on Orwell, Orwell's Ghost Wisdoms and Warnings for the 21st Century, will come out. And it is really a project, we talk a lot within academia about research-led teaching, but this is sort of teaching-led research more than research-led teaching, in that this is a project that really grew out of my experience teaching George Orwell, both in the UK and in the US. So from the moment that I got my first job at American University in 2009, I had had this idea that Orwell would be an amazing vehicle for teaching the history of the early 20th century, because not only does he write, 1984 is sort of one of the first novels of the Cold War, and Animal Farm as well, but he writes, about the Spanish Civil War in homage to Catalonia. He's writing about British imperialism and Burmese days. He's writing about the Depression and the social inequality of the early 20th century in The Road to Wigan Pier. He's dealing with the aftermath of the First World War, socially to a degree, in particular the Parisian aspects of Down and Out in Paris and London. And so I came to my new department chair when I arrived at AU, and I said, Bob, I'd really love to teach a course on, a history course, but told through the lens of Orwell's writing. And he said, Laura, no one would sign up for that, and enrollments are important at AU. And so no, I just shut it down. And then I waited him out. He passed away. And I was also then teaching in Britain at the University of Birmingham in the aftermath of Brexit. And all of a sudden with Brexit, the term Orwellian had come back on the radar in a major way, because there was all this discussion of the ways in which, the pink bus and the money that would go into the NHS after Brexit was a kind of Orwellian disinformation campaign. And Orwell was back in the ether. And so I proposed to my then department chair, Corey, could I do a course, a master's course on the early 20th century, but through the readings of George Orwell, paired with scholarly literature on some of the themes that he addressed. And Corey, just said, fine, do it. And I did. And it was meant to be a history course. It was really meant to be using Orwell's writing. And it was an MA course. We read widely. We did all of his novels and nonfiction books, but we also looked at Inside the Whale and read Such Were the Days, and used those to explore all these aspects of the early 20th century. But as I said, this was in the immediate aftermath of the Brexit vote. Students were constantly making connections between the 30s and 40s and the present day, and the continued relevance of Orwell. And then back at American University, in the early days of the pandemic, I was meant to have a research leave in the spring of 2022. But I also had a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old in the spring of 2022. So really, I had no research leave. In fact, I was a full-time mama for the better part of that. But I also missed that flip that everyone had to do to using this new thing called Zoom, right, which I had not heard of. And so I asked my department chair, could I do a summer course, just because we're likely to be online in the fall, and I kind of like to work out being online, and could I do it sort of similarly to this topic seminar I'd done at Birmingham, using Orwell to think about the early 20th century. And he said, sure. And I did it for undergraduates in the context of the pandemic. And again, those undergraduates in the summer of 2020, even more so than my MA students in the fall of 2016, really made these connections between the world that Orwell was living in and our current reality. And they were also the first people to teach me about cancel culture, because they were the ones who raised the question, reading Orwell, of whether Orwell, clearly being a molester figure in their minds and a misogynist, and I mean, they came to this immediately as they read Orwell. And they came to it from Burmese Days, which was the first novel we read. They said, this guy is a creep. And they asked me the question, would he be canceled now? And we had, big discussions about, what you do with scholars who have problematic aspects to their personalities and to their ideologies, but who also really have something valuable still to tell us. And that's something I'd be happy to talk about more in the Q&A, and something I do address in the book. And they were conscious not only of his misogyny, but also of the ways in which, despite the fact that his politics are on the side of the angels in terms of anti-imperialism, that there are strong racist undertones in a lot of what he writes. And so it was through the process of teaching Orwell, which I then continued to do once we returned to an in-person teaching space after the pandemic, and have been doing, once every year or two at AU. And those conversations with my students that really inspired the idea for Orwell's Ghost. And Orwell's Ghost it's not so much a biographical project. Peter Sweetley was one of the first readers, he can attest to. It has biography at the beginning, but it really says, it takes thematically the different strands within Orwell's writing. So there's a chapter on political isms, which uses as its key frame his essay Notes on Nationalism, but draws out his ideology, his thinking about different political ideologies in the 30s and 40s and how that relates to the present. There's a chapter that talks about the tension between Orwell's commitment to a kind of responsible and truthfulness in writing and his commitment to free speech, and what it means when you see truthfulness and freedom of speech coming into tension, which really foregrounds again homage to Catalonia and the deplatforming, to use a 21st century term, of Orwell when he tries to come back and publish Homage to Catalonia with Golantz. But it also looks at inequality. And really my favorite of Orwell's writings has always been The Road to Whig and Peer, which I first read in a course on political economy and remember being shocked to see it on the syllabus. But the more you think about it, the more really it is a work of political economy and has so much to tell us about social life and the dynamics of inequality in the 30s, that it really remains very relevant in our 21st century moment. And then it discusses the patriarchy, but it ends with what is always the sort of great surprise to my students, which is a discussion of Orwell's political vision and his commitment, which he held, from the mid-30s to his death, to a democratic socialism, and how, for students who really, in that they knew much of anything about Orwell, or readers who know much of anything about Orwell, when they come to him, think of him as the great, Cold War crusader, in a context of Animal Farm in particular, which, to give away my age, right? I was in middle school when the Berlin Wall came down, and I was probably once amongst the last generation who read Animal Farm in 6th grade to learn how bad the Soviet Union was, right? But for many people, I mean, I'm basically, Donald Trump Jr.'s age, or Holly's age, and you see them saying, Orwell would have been on our side, and they clearly see Orwell as Orwell the Cold Warrior, right? And the Orwell of Animal Farm. But to sort of step back and look at his broader politics, as they're articulated in The Lion and the Unicorn, and less coherently in parts of The Road to Whig and Peer and other places, and think, what kind of political vision did Orwell have for the future, and to what extent have any of those hopes been realized in our 21st century moment? So it really is using Orwell's writing on the 30s and 40s to engage with the problems of the present. And so that's how I came to this project. But it was also, to tie in, when she did your very sweet introduction, Amanda also mentioned that I write fairly regularly for CNN. And I did a couple of pieces as I was starting to think about these ideas. After the January 6th insurrection, I wrote a piece about whether and in what ways we were living in an Orwellian moment. And I then did another piece down the road about kind of misunderstandings of the idea of Orwellian, that really there'd been a huge spike in its usage after January 6th. And those pieces resonated with the CNN readership to a huge extent, in a way that made me think there really is a space for scholars, for historians, political scientists, literature scholars, to bring this knowledge of this author who has now been dead nearly 75 years, to a contemporary audience and to think about the intersections between history and contemporary political debates, which is something that's always been important to me in my scholarship. So I can see that my 10 minutes are now up, so I'm going to just stop talking and turn it over to Peter, the first and most illustrious of the Orwell scholars on our panel.
Yes, thank you so much, Laura. And yes, Peter, please.
Yes. Well, I don't really see I see myself. Thank you very much. Those were wonderful talks. I don't know if I'm on the big screen. It seems to be NACBS.
You
and
are,
I don't,
Peter. I can see you. You're here.
as recognized, behind me, there's the famous photograph, well, extracted from a group photograph of Orwell as a Burmese policeman. I'm not using any visuals, but that's the only visual. We've been asked to say very briefly, you know, how one began Orwell studies, and also what my most recent work is. As I wrote a senior essay when at Yale about four Englishmen who had been participating in involved in the Spanish Civil War: John Cornford, Julian Bell, Stephen Spender, and George Orwell. And then subsequently, Billy Abrams and I deriving the sense from that work, we wrote a book, Journey to the Frontier, about Cornford and Bell, both of whom were killed in Spain. And then subsequently, we wrote two biographical studies. They were never intended to be, some thought we had a fraught relationship with Sonia Brownell Orwell. Some thought we intended to write a complete biography. We never intended to write a study. We intended to write just through the Spanish Civil War, which is what we did. But somewhat inadvertently, it was also turned out to be important in unlocking because Orwell had said, "I don't want a biography," and there's a dispute about how seriously he meant that. But the books unlock the biographical logjam, in that Sonia appointed Bernard Crick as the official biographer. She tried, when the book was finished, to stop its publication, but Crick had a guarantee that it was going to be published. And then the Orwell scholarship, both biographically and critically, is now become immense. And as we all know, thanks to Donald Trump and alternate facts, and also the great sense of computers and AI, Orwell has never been as read as he is now. I mean, he was a very popular, successful novelist with Animal Farm and 1984. But now it's beyond that, which is extraordinary. But then to jump, I recently, a year ago, January, Stanford University Press brought out this very short book, The Socialist Patriot. And what's, obviously the issues that I discuss in this book have been touched upon in the huge Orwell scholarship. But the theme of the book, well, the major theme of the book is Orwell is as the title has it, a socialist patriot. And this is English tradition. William Morris, William Blake, E.P. Thompson, individuals who have a deep, deep love of their country, but at the same time are deeply critical of it and are on the left. As Laura said, a democratic socialist. And I thought that the crucial things that the theme of what I hope is somewhat new or more emphasized in this study than perhaps in others is why one would call Orwell a socialist patriot. And I think it's his connection with war. And the four wars that I discuss in the book are the First World War, the Spanish Civil War, the Second World War, and the Cold War. And I think Orwell's the importance to Orwell of the Spanish Civil War and the Cold War, I think, have been much discussed. But and it's the take on this book that the importance to him of making him a socialist patriot of the First World War and the Second World War, though obviously not ignored, and have not becoming given sufficient weight. And of course, he was 11 when the First World War broke out. But also, maybe not sufficient attention is given to the degree that Orwell and his family were members of the official class. His father was a civil servant in the opium trade in India, which is always rather sort of intriguing. And he had the super education of his class. He went into this and of course, he wrote a famous essay, Such Were the Joys. He went to a very traditional grand prep school, St. Cyprian's, and then he went to the most famous boarding school, public school in England, Eton. And during the First World War, and he was he had no choice. Both in the prep school and at Eton, he was in the officer training corps. And growing up in Edwardian England, when England was at its most powerful and most military in many ways, that this imbued him, I think, and that he loved his country, but also that he was shaped by this intense patriotism. You almost would call jingoism, though I don't think he was never a jingo, of the period before the First World War and during the First World War itself. And we discovered the first publication of his was almost embarrassingly sentimental, sentimental may not be the right word, poem about how everybody has to enlist. You're a coward if you don't enlist. Inspired by a cousin of his who had been killed in the very first officer in the army who had been killed in the very first months of the First World War. So the influence of the atmosphere and his education in the time of the First World War and just before the First World War, I think was extremely important. And then, of course, again, an aspect that has been paid attention to, but not, in my view, sufficiently, in the Second World War, where he published the short little book, which he didn't want republished, which was an interesting issue, The Lion and the Unicorn, which are, after all, the heraldic beasts for the Royal Coat of Arms. And then the subtitle, Socialism and the English Genius, and which he argued that in order to win the war, Britain would have to become a socialist society. Of course, that didn't happen. It was a typical sort of British compromise of moving towards moving towards socialism, but not becoming socialist. And also, of course, the welfare state after the war, in a way, fulfilled that promise partially. And so I tried to argue in the book that these two wars, the First World War and the Second World War, though obviously not ignored, were in scholarship and discussions of Orwell, were incredibly important in making these terms that somehow I think we somehow have a feeling they're almost somewhat contradictory. Can you be both a socialist and a patriot? And as I say, I think it's also an English tradition that's not unknown. Orwell is not unique, but I think that we almost have a sort of resistance to the idea that these are compatible categories. And I think Orwell certainly. It's my argument that and I don't think it's particularly controversial, but maybe it is. That would be interesting. Orwell was very much as a deeply committed democratic socialism. Of course, he had that wonderful caveat when he stated that at the time, when writing about the Spanish Civil War, as I understand it, and so he could qualify it as he wished, but that he was a democratic socialist, but also the famous piece about the toad. He had this deep love. Being a gardener at Wallingford, and then of course in Jura, he had this deep love, I think, of his country, as well as feeling my cliche about Britain is that the British are incredibly adept at making profound changes, deep changes, in order to stay as much the same as possible. And Orwell, in many ways, is an example of that. So I'll stop there.
All right, thank you so much, Peter. Okay, so thank you all for the wonderful comments. And then at this point, we're going to open it up to audience Q&A. So if you have a question, please either, raise your hand with the little Zoom hand or drop it into the chat. I'll just give folks a couple of minutes to... All right, let me go ahead and I'll just read this for the recording. So, apropos of Thompson et al. With their middle-class origins, could they really understand working-class Moors? Also, did they know of Jack London on People of the Abyss? Oh, Peter, you're on mute if you want to unmute. There you go.
At the end of the question, did they know
of Jack London on People of the Abyss?
Oh, Orwell was a great admirer. He writes quite a bit about Jack London, and of course he went down and out. But of course he's searching for material. He didn't really need to do that financially. But he's a dishwasher in Paris, and then he was a bum. Staying in whatever, in England, and he's recognized as an Etonian down on his luck. I think he was aware. It is true that people such as E.P. Thompson, William Morris, who's very rich. I don't know how well off William Blake was, but presumably fairly well off. They weren't working class, but I think they, in The Road to Wigan Pier, which in many ways is a controversial book, Orwell tried to find out about the working class. So he made very great. So I think, there were failures, but I think largely successful.
Can I speak to that as well, Amanda? Yes, I mean, the Jack London, he is very conscious of it. And the down and out, there is both in the conception of the project, but also in the style of writing, you can see the obvious homage, Dave. But on the bigger question, I mean, it speaks to this longer tradition within the British left, right, of what Seth Coben, called the act of slumming, and there is an element of sort of slight fatuousness of Orwell, who's living with his parents, in suburbia in this very middle class life for much of the time that he's doing this social investigation that leads to the London half of Down and Out. And he kind of goes into London, does a quick outfit change, dirties himself up, and then goes slumming, and then comes back out to suburbia where his sister is picking up after him. I mean, and so you wonder to what degree, as Peter says, he was just conceived of as Newtonian down on his luck. I mean, that's what he claims, but to what degree he was believed when he was incognito in London. But he really is, he's undergoing a process of serious social investigation. And you can see in his notebooks, in his archive, I mean, he's listening for language, he's thinking, he's observing, and he's, I think, one of the great social observers of his era. And that's really one of his strengths that comes through in Down and Out, but comes through even more in The Road to Wigan Pier, where I think there is an advantage in that there's not a pretense involved, right? He's owning the fact that he is a social investigator from the middle class when he goes up north to do the research for that book. But I actually think one of the things that he writes about class so well, and I think he is very perceptive about the working classes, but he's most perceptive, I think, about the lower upper middle class from which he comes, right? And he can write with the knowledge of experience really perceptively about the anxieties of that group that sees itself as very much a kind of pushed middle, or in between, even though it's really a pushed very upper middle, more than lower upper middle. But that the consciousness of that group, which really is important to the left intelligentsia, right, and the ways in which they feel themselves to be oppressed, even though objectively they are not, come through, I think, very clearly in both his, in Such Were the Days, but also in parts of The Road to Wigan Pier, where he talks about this phenomenon of being raised to believe that the working classes smelled, and of the importance of keeping up appearances and the anxieties attendant on that. So yes, I definitely think that just his middle classness doesn't disqualify him from speaking on inequality and understanding the impact of inequality within the British system at that point.
Excellent, thank you. We've got another question. So do we still need Orwell to understand British liberalism? Eileen, you want to?
I could take that one, at least initially. I'd love to hear Peter and Laura's thoughts on this one too. It's a great question. I think we do, and it is for a deeply historical reason that I believe Orwell turned towards liberalism after World War II, almost immediately in the aftermath of World War II. And we know this because of these drafts of Human Rights Manifesto that he co-wrote with Arthur Koestler, Mamain Koestler, Bertrand Russell, and in the winter of 1946 through the spring of 1946. And these manifesto drafts, which are in the Orwell archive, in the archive of Koestler, and the archive of Russell, and myself and a grad student are compiling them and creating a complete transcript for the first time of all the different versions and their edits. What we've been able to discover is this remarkable commitment, especially on the part of Orwell, to the idea of the post-French Revolutionary conception of universal human rights, although with the caveat that he's not as interested in the rights of women as he is in the rights of man. And so what I would say is after World War II, Orwell has a reinvigorated commitment to certain classical ideas of liberalism rooted in, especially the 19th century, post-French Revolutionary context. But what he lacks, curiously, given the fact that his mother and his favorite aunt were suffragists, is a commitment to the idea of women's rights. And I do not think Orwell really ever is able to fully embrace the concept of women's rights fully. So I believe he becomes more liberal after World War II, but and in some ways, I think we can read 1984 as an exploration of certain feminist themes, especially in the character of Julia. But I think the big interpretive question, I think, is important to consider is why does Orwell resist feminism so strongly over the course of his lifetime, given his intellectual debts to his mother and aunt, and his very strong turn towards certain core fundamental liberal ideas, including universal, at least the rights of man, and democracy after World War II. Thanks.
Laura, did you want to add?
one's using.
I'll let Peter come in first.
Yeah, Peter.
Excuse me.
Go
Oh,
ahead.
just very briefly. I think it's very important to remember that he was a socialist, and as he understood it, a democratic socialist. So if you're using liberal with a small L, I would say yes. If you're using liberal with a large L, I would say no. Politically, he wasn't officially. I think it's very important to remember that he was a socialist.
And I mean, I think I would like to, because I think it's one of your great lines from The Socialist Patriot, Peter, but to bring up, Peter makes this wonderful analogy to describing Orwell as a kind of combination of Edmund Burke and Tom Paine. And I think that the Burke-Paine analogy is a great one, right? I mean, there's a kind of a cultural conservatism, a Burkean respect for institutions and for, for Britain's long history from the Magna Carta to the present, right? Of the rule of law and respect for traditional pillars of social and cultural as well as legal authority, but also the radicalism of Paine, right? And the radicalism of Paine is what informs his democratic socialism and makes him think that Beveridge hasn't gone far enough by far, right? I mean, he is not a capital L liberal, but he's also remains a cultural conservative throughout his career. And I think one of the tensions that's really apparent in The Lion and the Unicorn and in some of the other essays he writes during the war is that when he talks about revolution and the need for revolution in Britain, he says on paper, right, that this revolution might be violent, it might be bloody, but there's actually so many contradictions in that because he thinks the English people are fundamentally law-abiding and fundamentally respectful of institutions. And you can tell he doesn't really believe that blood will run in the streets, Moscow, 1917 style, but that the revolution that he hopes will come about, if it does, will come about in some kind of orderly English fashion that preserves as much as it revolutionizes.
Yeah, and also to mention where the essay that he writes, where he talks most about what was happening to him before the First World War and during the First World War, the very short essay that he writes at the time of the outbreak of the Second World War, which has this most wonderful title, which again sums up things: My Country, Right or Left?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to follow up very quickly on Peter's very astute comment about whether we're thinking about big L liberalism or small liberalism. That's a very important point. Also, we have to remember, and you all know this because of your work in British studies, but we have to think about differences between, say, US liberalism and the way that's been conceptualized over time and British liberalism. And I think in Britain, there's a way in which even into the present, big L liberalism is seen as problematic, a kind of middle position between conservatives and labor, and I think that whereas in the US, I mean, we have this bifurcated view of liberalism. It can even cover the left in some cases, and then the right on the other side. So Orwell, I think, does occupy something of a middle position, and I think he is blending elements of small L liberalism rooted in the French Revolutionary idea of the rights of man and representative democracy, but he's also combining that with socialism and certain elements of patriotism for sure. And I think if he had nationalist elements before World War II, during World War II, during the Blitz, because of the intense terror of the Blitz and his desire for England and for Britain to be preserved in the war, I think they fade in 1945. We see this in You and the Atom Bomb, where he like Bertrand Russell is becoming pacifist again in the wake of the horror of the atom bomb and what that could do to the whole world. So I think after World War II, literally the whole political landscape changes. Orwell is painfully aware of that. and I think ends up blending more liberal and democratic ideas with his socialism. This manifesto that I mentioned that he started writing in early 1946 and collaborated with Tusla Russell and Mamain Paget with, in the first version, which he probably wrote, although we don't have that version extant anymore. We have a version of it that probably has the input of other authors, including his friend Michael Foote. But in the surviving version in the oral archive, he talks about different forms of government that are present in the world. And the fourth one that he affirms as the one we should have but don't have yet is democracy plus national planning. So in other words, the post-World War II Orwell is an Orwell that's trying to synthesize a kind of a vision of liberal democracy grounded on the rights of man with with national planning. That's socialism. And so that's how I read him in that post-1945 moment.
Amanda, can I come in one last time? I know there are other questions, but this sort of speaks to some of the others, because I think one of the things that we haven't brought up in terms of his politics is the degree to which he did have a commitment to the necessity for an anti-imperial politics as part of a socialist revolution. And he does own up to the tensions of that. I mean, there's one essay, 1946 essay in Tribune, the left publication, that Nye Bevan, who Chad brings up in his question, is involved with, where he talks about the trade-offs between the program of the Attlee government and empire. And he says, if it's really true that our comparative comfort is simply a product of imperialism, that such things as the beverage scheme, increased old age pensions, raising the school leaving age, slum clearance, improved health services and whatnot are luxuries that we can only afford if we have millions of Oriental slaves at our command. That is surely something that we have to face facts and look at in the eye. And in 1984, I mean, the global South is basically something that's fought over as a source of cheap labor and mineral extraction. And he's very upfront about that. And so understanding the way in which an anti-imperial politics is braided in with Orwell's sense of what a social revolution needs to look like from the get-go is something that is, despite the fact that he isn't perfect in terms of the line he walks racially, something that I think we need to take account of in understanding Orwell's political project.
All right, thank you. And then, so we have two sort of similar questions here. Thank you for a very interesting panel. Can Eileen say more about the substance of the controversies within Orwell scholarship about addressing the evidence he committed sexual assault? And then to go off of that, we have also, to spin off Allison's question on Orwell's sexual politics, Eileen mentioned Kussler, whose sexual politics are well known, and Thompson's working class is mainly male, and isn't the reason his papers are closed because of marital infidelity?
Yes, I'll take those quickly, but I'd love to hear Peter and Laura's thoughts as well on those questions. So yes, there is a controversy in Orwell studies right now about Orwell and sexual assault. The short answer is that Anna Funder published a very explosive book last fall or last summer called Wifedom, which is on the face of it a biography of Orwell's first wife, Eileen O'Shaughnessy, but is much more than that. And it was, she is a very prominent award-winning Australian journalist. She's published some very important books. She's a great writer for sure. And she tells a compelling story, I think, overall, although it was very controversial because of the way in which she really, I think, for the first time in a very highly visible book, Orwell's multiple perpetrations of sexual violence were exposed in a systematic way over the course of his lifetime, and there was a lot of controversy about just that alone. But I think, interestingly, what was more controversial about her book was that she didn't get all the facts straight about Orwell's life, and there was some sloppy history where she, for example, confused India and Burma, which is just inexcusable. I don't know why she did that or why her editors didn't catch it, but it ended up undermining, I think, the power of her core thesis, which was to do this systematic feminist investigative journalism to really expose the sexual assault history in Orwell's life. Now, other people had done this. So it's not as though Anna Funder was the first person to do this, and you're all historians, so you know it's always a bit false when people claim to be the first to do anything. But she was probably the most prominent person to do this. I mean, I had published on Orwell's first girlfriend, Jacintha Buddicom, and his sexual assault of her, for example, in 2021. And I grounded that work in Dione Venable's publication in 2006 of the annotated edition of her cousin's memoir of growing up with Eric Blair, Eric Anas. And Dione was really the first person to go into the family archive and dig up all this material and make it known to the public. And I don't think that can be underscored enough. And that's, I think, been widely ignored in scholarship. And I could speculate about reasons, but I don't want to take up all the time here. So that's the reason why there's a controversy in Orwell studies right now. But I have to say, for myself, it's been difficult because I've been working on this project for a few years, and I feel like it's, I don't know if any of you have had this experience, but you feel like you've been working on a project and then all of a sudden, the project blows up around you, It's not really clear. You should keep walking into the fire, as it were. But the second question, just remind me, it was a question related to that, but I can't remember now.
You mentioned Kussler, whose sexual politics are well known. And
yes.
Then the main reason that Thompson's papers are closed because of marital infidelity.
Okay, well, I can speak to Kussler. Okay, So I have been to Edinburgh to study the Kussler papers. It is clear that archive is literally shut up, like, do not enter. I mean, the vast portions of that archive are not accessible and maybe never will be. And I'm guessing it's because of the history of sexual assault, which is widely documented. And yet still there's a resistance to acknowledge it. There's especially among I believe his literary executors, and as a result, there is a push against scholars who want to explore this dimension of both Orwell and Kussler. So I found it frustrating because I think a lot of material in the Kussler archive is shut up that has nothing to do with Orwell's history of sexual assault. For example, there is one file up there that has to do with the production of the 1946 Human Rights Manifesto with Orwell. And you can't get access to that, period. And it's probably because there's one letter in there that has to do with something vile in Kussler's personal history. And as a result, scholars can't get access to the material about the formation of this Human Rights Manifesto. So it is, yes, this controversy has been going on for decades. I think there has been a systematic attempt on the part of family members to cover up stuff. There's been a lot of stuff pulled back and kept hidden in family archives on both the Orwell and the Kussler side. I'm up for a challenge, but I also am wary of stepping any further into this, if it continues to be so explosive. Thanks.
Thank you. And then Laura or Peter, Laura, would you like to add?
I'll briefly add to that Eileen's mentioned Venable's re-edition of Eric and Us with her annotations, including the revelation about this sexual assault on Buddicom when they were young. And that came out in 2007. So, just on the eve of Me Too. it was interesting going back and looking at the way that that was reviewed in different spaces. And Gordon Bowker, who's done a biography of Orwell, reviewed the book in the TLS, and he refers to this as a pounce, and says, well, the pounce became Orwell's preferred method of seduction. And then Catherine Hughes, who's a Guardian columnist, says the attempted rape, which she puts in quotes, in truth sounds more like a botched seduction. And it's hard to imagine, even 5 years later, that being the way these revelations were treated, right? There's been a huge reevaluation, I think, of how seriously we take accusations of personal misconduct. And it's part of the reason that, as Lawrence says, Kessler has such a tainted reputation at the moment. And, E.P. Thompson and other members of the left are really being scrutinized, but it raises a question of what you do, right? And I think part of the reason that Wifedom and Funder's book had this controversy is, as Eileen says, the sloppy scholarship, but there was also an element of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? Because there was so much anger in it that I think put people's backs up, saying, well, given the things we know about Orwell, doesn't that delegitimize Orwell? And I think that that's problematic and risky. And it's something I see in the classroom a lot, right? That this desire to pull down heroes, we don't, or we shouldn't stop reading the Declaration of Independence because it was written by someone who had a very problematic relationship with his slaves, right? And yet there is increasingly this move away. I see my son is in middle school in 6th grade, and he still knows little or nothing about the founding fathers, despite being in a very good state school system. And I think it's partly because there's this shrinking away from looking at the man in full when the man has, or sometimes the woman, but mostly the man, right, has problematic parts of their past. And it underscores the need for looking those faults in the eye, but then understanding them within the context of a fuller life, which is something that I seek to do in Orwell's Ghost, but which I also think the scholarship is doing much better. I mean, David Taylor just came out with a new version of his Orwell biography, Orwell: The New Life. And in it, he addresses, we're totally, the only time the word assault appeared was in reference to military actions in the first version of his biography. Now you keyword search the word assault and it's in reference to, his relations with various women in his life. And so I think we are coming to a moment where scholars are recognizing the importance of engaging with those aspects of Orwell's and other great men's histories and reputations.
Thank you so much.
I just have a quick follow-up.
Please go ahead.
Just David Taylor's biography was one of the books I reviewed for the TLS last summer. I reviewed 5 books on Orwell, including Peter's book, most recent book. And I actually found the opposite, I'll have to say, Laura. I mean, it's been a while, but I mean, I remember doing a similar systematic review of his treatment of the sexual assault issue. And I found Taylor lacking. I think he could have done a lot more.
He could have, but the first version is nothing.
Very telling he did not. And the other thing I found very interesting about his 2 versions is in the first version, he actually did mention that Eileen O'Shaughnessy, Orwell's first wife, wrote a poem right before she met Orwell called "End of the Century, 1984," published in her high school's alumni magazine. And it had Huxleyan themes, Brave New World themes to it, and has some parallels with 1984, the novel. And he mentions that in this first book, which comes out, I think, in 2000. And he even cites the scholarship of Sally Coniam, who was the teacher at this high school who discovered this poem, long forgotten, and was able to draw a direct connection between Eileen O'Shaughnessy's poetic vision and 1984, the novel. And then interesting, that drops out in this new version. So I'm a little skeptical of David Taylor's scholarship, and I think it's quite interesting that there's been this firestorm about Funder, but very little very little serious critical engagement of some of the moves that David Taylor has made around gender and sex in his accounting of Orwell's life.
Well, I know that David doesn't believe that the title came from that poem, which sort of seems hard to credit. But Peter, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that and about the impact or lack thereof of Eileen in 1984.
Well, I don't know about I'm aware about the poem, but I don't really have enough knowledge. I mean, of course, and also it's very difficult. I have to be careful not to be defensive about Anna Funder's wifedom, because I'm grouped with the other male biographers of Orwell as members of the patriarchy, but also what's also mentioned. I mean, the book is full of incredible errors, but also what's not mentioned, it's this new sort of genre which one has mixed feelings about, which is called, I think, creative nonfiction, and she has lots of made up dialogues and so forth and so on. It's a very and also I think she misrepresents Eileen, as Quentin Kopp has pointed out. But of course, he can also be seen as being defensive, where Eileen, in a funny sort of way. Maybe we shouldn't talk that much about the book, but in a funny sort of way, she misrepresents Eileen, in that she presents Eileen as being deeply exploited by Orwell, which in many ways she was. But that's what she I think a lot of people feel that's what she chose. She knew what she was doing. In a funny sort of way, she's almost more intelligent than Funder gives her credit for. I think she was very self-aware. She knew that she was very much serving as Orwell's assistant, not only cleaning the lavatory, but helping in the cottage in Wallingford, but also helping him with his work. And also, she criticizes him for not mentioning her in Homage to Catalonia. But the book it's not in many ways, well, again, that's a whole huge subject. So it's all, and I thought maybe wifedom might sort of sink Orwell, but it certainly hasn't. I mean, he, like all of us, has many flaws, but he's more attention is being paid to him, both critical, which is good, critical in the negative sense, which is good. But as I say, he also has never been more read or more paid attention to. So it's a interestingly paradoxical situation, and a rich situation in many ways.
Yeah, and thank you. And so with that, in the interest of time, I will go ahead and wrap things up. But thank you so much to Eileen and Laura and Peter for joining us today. And thanks to everyone for dropping your questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get a chance to directly address them. But I hope that everyone will join me in thanking our guests today. All right, bye everyone.
Thank you all for coming out.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Eileen, and thank you, Peter.
We could pursue the idea of all gathering together approximately a year from now at Stanford.
Yeah, I would love that, Peter. So let's
thank you so much.